In 1716, a merchant captain sailing through the Caribbean made a decision he would regret for the rest of his short life. He steered his vessel too close to the coast of New Providence Island in the Bahamas. Within minutes, a black flag climbed the mast of a ship anchored in the harbor. Within an hour, his crew was disarmed, his cargo was gone, and his ship had been repainted and renamed. The captain was set adrift in a longboat with 3 days of water and a single compass. He was one of the lucky ones. Because Nassau in the early 1700s wasn't just a pirate port. It was something far more dangerous and far more fascinating. It was a functioning anarchist republic, a city of outlaws that controlled the most strategically important shipping lanes in the Atlantic world, that generated more wealth per capita than London, and that operated entirely without kings, governors, laws, or God. At its peak, Nassau was home to over 2,000 pirates. Blackbeard walked these streets, and Bonny drank in these taverns. Calico Jack planned his raids from these shores. And for nearly a decade, this small, sweltering island at the edge of the known world represented the single greatest threat to British imperial commerce in history. This is the story of how it happened, and why the people who built it were simultaneously the most terrifying and the most revolutionary figures of their age. To understand Nassau, you first have to understand what the Caribbean looked like in 1700. The Atlantic was the highway of the world. Every ounce of silver from the Spanish mines in Peru, every pound of sugar from the English plantations in Jamaica, every bale of tobacco from the Virginia colonies, all of it moved by ship across these waters. The volume of trade was staggering. A single treasure fleet from Havana to Seville might carry the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars in gold and silver coin. And protecting all of this wealth was essentially impossible. The Caribbean is not one ocean. It is thousands of islands, hundreds of hidden coves, dozens of narrow channels where a small, fast ship can disappear in minutes. The Spanish tried to protect their fleets with armed escorts. The English tried to patrol with Royal Navy frigates. None of it worked. The geography itself was on the side of the pirates. New Providence Island sat at the center of all of this. It was perfectly positioned, close enough to the main shipping lanes between Europe and the colonies that a ship leaving the harbor could intercept Atlantic traffic within hours. Protected by a harbor so shallow that large warships couldn't enter, which meant Royal Navy vessels couldn't follow pirates inside. Covered in dense tropical vegetation that made it essentially invisible from the sea until you were already inside the reef. The British had tried to maintain a colony there since 1666. It never quite worked. Governors came and went. The colonists were poor, fractious, and largely ungovernable. Spanish raiding parties burned the settlement twice. By 1706, the official British presence had collapsed entirely. The last royal governor sailed away and didn't come back. He left behind a ruined fort, about 1,000 struggling colonists, and an island that now belonged to no one. That was when Benjamin Hornigold arrived. Hornigold was not what most people picture when they think of a pirate captain. He was educated, methodical, and deeply political. He had served as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, one of thousands of sailors licensed by the British government to attack enemy shipping. When the war ended in 1713 and those licenses were canceled, Hornigold faced a choice that tens of thousands of sailors faced simultaneously. He could accept whatever miserable work the peacetime maritime economy had to offer, or he could continue doing exactly what he'd been doing, just without the government's permission. He chose the second option, and he was not alone. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession unleashed something unprecedented. Approximately 40,000 sailors were discharged from naval service across Britain, Spain, France, and the Netherlands within the space of 2 years. These were men trained to fight, accustomed to danger, and now facing starvation wages in a peacetime labor market that had no use for them. They knew the sea routes, they knew how to handle guns and navigate by stars. They knew exactly which ships were carrying what cargo and when. thousands of them converged on Nassau. Hornigold had a vision for the island that went beyond simple piracy. He wanted to build something permanent, a safe harbor not just for himself, but for every outlaw sailor who needed one. He organized the harbor. He established informal rules about where ships would anchor and how disputes would be settled. He created what historians would later call the Pirate Republic, a genuine, functioning alternative society built on principles that the established world considered revolutionary and dangerous. In Nassau, there were no class distinctions of the kind that defined every city in Europe. A common sailor who had spent his entire career being flogged and starved by aristocratic captains could walk into any tavern in Nassau as an equal. Pirate crews voted on their decisions. They elected their captains. They could remove those captains if they proved incompetent or too brutal. The spoils of every raid were divided by written contract, drawn up before the voyage, signed by every member of the crew. Articles, they called them. The Pirate Articles were the most democratic governing document in the Atlantic world at a time when democracy was still considered a dangerous and subversive idea. By 1715, Nassau had transformed beyond anything Hornigold had originally imagined. The population had exploded. Ships crowded the harbor so thickly that you could walk across the anchorage stepping from deck to deck. The settlement on shore had grown from a few collapsed buildings into a sprawling, chaotic, entirely self-sufficient city. There were taverns, dozens of them, serving cheap rum distilled from Bahamian sugarcane and expensive wine looted from French merchant vessels. There were brothels, gambling houses, and chandlers' shops selling stolen rope and canvas. There were blacksmiths, coopers, and sailmakers who asked no questions about whose ship they were repairing. There were also printing shops. Pirate captains were surprisingly literate men, and Nassau had a small but lively pamphlet culture. Proclamations, articles, manifestos, and occasionally satirical broadsides directed at the British Crown. The economy was entirely circular. Pirates raided merchant ships. They brought the cargo back to Nassau. The merchants of Nassau bought it at a fraction of its real value and sold it to the colonists at something approaching a profit. The colonists bought food, rum, and services with the money they made from the pirates. The pirates used their share of the plunder to buy provisions for the next voyage. The whole system was self-sustaining in a way that the official colonial economy had never managed to be. At the center of this world, walking through the streets with his enormous black beard elaborately braided and tied with red ribbons, was a man the entire Atlantic world feared. Edward Teach. Blackbeard. History has turned Blackbeard into a cartoon, the quintessential pirate, all growling menace and theatrical cruelty. The reality is considerably more interesting and considerably more terrifying. Teach was intelligent, strategic, and possessed of a psychological sophistication that modern military commanders would recognize immediately. He understood that fear was more valuable than force. A merchant captain who surrendered without a fight cost no lives and lost no time. A merchant captain who needed to be defeated in combat was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. So Teach cultivated his image with the deliberateness of a modern public relations campaign. The beard was theatrical. The slow fuses he wound into his hair and lit before battle, sending tendrils of sulfurous smoke curling around his face, were theatrical. The 14 pistols he reportedly wore in crossed bandoliers across his chest were theatrical, though they were also entirely functional. The image of a demonic figure emerging from a cloud of his own smoke, bristling with weapons, was carefully designed to produce a specific effect. It worked almost without exception. In 2 years of operation out of Nassau, Blackbeard captured over 40 vessels and never once lost a battle. Not because he was the most skilled fighter in the Caribbean, though he was formidable, but because most of his opponents simply didn't fight. They saw the Queen Anne's Revenge approaching with its black flag climbing the mast, recognized the silhouette of its captain on the deck, and struck their colors before the first shot was fired. He was a weapon made of reputation, and Nassau was the forge that made him. But Nassau was never just about the famous names. The real story of the Pirate Republic lives in the hundreds of ordinary sailors whose names never appeared in the London newspapers. Men like Caesar, a formerly enslaved African who became one of Blackbeard's most trusted officers, and who reportedly had instructions to blow up the Queen Anne's Revenge rather than let her be captured. A final act of defiance that says everything about what freedom meant to men who had known what it was to have none of it. Women, too. Nassau was not a welcoming place for women by any modern standard, but it produced Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most ferocious fighters in pirate history, who dressed as men, served as full crew members, and by multiple accounts, fought harder than anyone else when their ship was finally taken. When Calico Jack Rackham's crew was surprised by a Royal Navy sloop and most of the men were below decks drinking, too drunk to fight, it was Bonny and Read who came up swinging. The court that later tried them couldn't quite figure out what to do with this information. Nassau gave these people something that the official world had never offered, a place where the rules that had been designed to keep them at the bottom of every hierarchy simply did not apply, where your accent didn't determine your social standing, where the color of your skin didn't determine whether you were a person or property, where a woman could pick up a cutlass and be judged on how she used it rather than on what she was supposed to be. This is what made Nassau genuinely revolutionary. Not the theft. The theft was just capitalism turned upside down. What was revolutionary was the social order that grew up around it. By 1717, London had decided that enough was enough. The losses were catastrophic. Maritime insurance rates in the city of London had tripled. Major trading companies were reporting that certain Caribbean routes had become effectively impassable. One estimate put the total value of ships and cargo lost to Nassau-based pirates in the previous 5 years at something equivalent to several billion modern dollars. King George I issued a royal proclamation offering a general pardon to any pirate who surrendered before September 5, 1718. Those who refused would be hunted down and executed. It was a brilliant piece of political strategy. The pardon divided Nassau instantly. Some pirates, men who had taken to the sea out of desperation rather than ideology, who missed their families, or simply feared the gallows, accepted gratefully. Others refused absolutely, seeing the pardon for what it also was, the end of everything they had built. Hornigold himself accepted the pardon. He became a pirate hunter, sailing out of Nassau to track down his former colleagues. History does not record exactly what he felt about this transformation. The journals he may have kept have not survived. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau on July 26, 1718. He came with 3 Royal Navy warships, several hundred soldiers, and a commission as Royal Governor of the Bahamas. He also came with a gallows, pre-built and ready to be erected on the beach. 8 pirates refused the pardon and were tried within weeks of Rogers' arrival. They were hanged on the beach in full view of the harbor, their bodies left on public display as a message to anyone still considering refusal. Rogers watched from horseback. The crowd watching from the beach was largely silent. Nassau's 10-year experiment as a free republic was effectively over. What replaced it was a functioning British colony, law-abiding and loyal, with a governor's mansion where Hornigold's makeshift fort had stood. But it didn't end cleanly. It never ends cleanly. Blackbeard had seen what was coming and moved his operation north to the Carolina coast. He died there in November 1718 in a vicious close-quarters battle with a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard. The fight was so brutal that Teach reportedly continued attacking after receiving 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 sword cuts. He finally went down from blood loss. Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of his ship. Calico Jack Rackham was taken in October 1718 near Jamaica, drunk and offered almost no resistance. He was hanged in Port Royal. His body was hung in a metal cage on a small islet at the harbor entrance, a navigational landmark that sailors named Rackham's Cay, a name that stuck for over a century. Bonny, pregnant at the time of her capture, received a stay of execution. She disappears from the historical record entirely after 1721. No notice, no marriage record, no further mention. She simply vanishes, which somehow seems appropriate. Mary Read died in prison of fever before she could be executed. Some historians believe she may have been pregnant as well. The records are incomplete. Charles Vane, one of the most stubborn holdouts, who had refused the pardon and been expelled from Nassau by a popular vote of the pirates themselves for cowardice in battle, a detail that says everything about the social standards of the Republic, was eventually captured, tried, and hanged in Jamaica in 1720. One by one, the figures of Nassau's golden age were eliminated. The hangings continued through 1722. By the time they were finished, the golden age of piracy was over. Not gradually, not with a long decline, it was surgically removed in the space of about 4 years. So what really happened at Nassau? What was the Pirate Republic in the end? Romantics will tell you it was a utopia, a brief flowering of genuine freedom in a world built on slavery, hierarchy, and aristocratic privilege, and there's truth in that. The articles that governed pirate crews were more egalitarian than any governing document in the official Atlantic world. The men and women who sailed under the black flag were in many cases people who had no other path to dignity or agency. Cynics will tell you it was simply organized crime, violent men stealing from other men, dressing it up in the language of freedom to feel better about themselves. And there's truth in that too. The merchants who were robbed did not experience it as a revolutionary act. The sailors who were pressed into pirate service at Cutlass Point did not find it liberating. What Nassau actually was, what makes it genuinely historically significant, is something more complicated than either version. It was proof of concept. It demonstrated that the organizational structures that justified the existing world, that only kings could govern, that only aristocrats could lead, that ordinary sailors and servants and slaves were incapable of organizing themselves, were simply false. The Pirate Republic was chaotic and brutal, and often terrible, but it worked. On its own terms, for its own purposes, it worked better than the official colony that had preceded it. The British understood this implicitly, which is why they moved so quickly and so decisively to destroy it. Nassau wasn't just a commercial threat, it was an ideological one. An island full of outlaws proving that hierarchy was optional was considerably more dangerous than an island full of outlaws stealing cargo. The timing is not coincidental. The ideas incubated in places like Nassau about democratic governance, about the social contract, about the rights of ordinary men to have a say in their own fate, would flower 60 years later in Philadelphia and Paris. The sailors who built the Pirate Republic didn't write pamphlets that survived. They didn't found universities or give famous speeches, but they lived the argument out loud, in full view of the Atlantic world, for a decade. Nassau today is the capital of the Bahamas. It is a modern city of banking towers and luxury resorts, of cruise ship terminals and international airports. The harbor where Blackbeard anchored his fleet is now lined with marinas for private yachts. The beach where Woodes Rogers hanged 8 men on a single morning is now part of a tourist promenade. Occasionally, when they're dredging the harbor for development, they find things. Anchors from the wrong century, cannonballs. Once, the remains of a hull buried in the sediment, a ship that no one had reported sinking in water too shallow for it to have been lost by accident. Maritime archaeologists have identified at least a dozen potential wrecks from the pirate era in the waters around now Providence. Most have never been properly excavated. The waters around Nassau are murky, the currents unpredictable, and the political will to spend money diving on pirate wrecks has never quite materialized. But in 2019, a dive team working off the western coast of New Providence found something they weren't looking for. At about 30 feet of depth in a natural crevice in the reef, they found a cache of artifacts that dated unmistakably to the early 18th century. Spanish silver coins, a corroded pistol of English manufacture, several personal items, a bronze medallion, a bone comb, a small glass bottle that still contained traces of something dark and viscous. No ship, no hull, just these objects wedged into the reef as if they had been placed there deliberately, or as if whatever vessel carried them had broken apart on the reef and scattered its contents into the crevice over 3 centuries. The artifacts were removed, cataloged, and are currently in storage at the Bahamian National Museum. They have never been publicly displayed. The location of the find is not on any publicly available dive map. Someone knows what ship they came from. They haven't said. What are we to make of Nassau? Of the men and women who built something extraordinary in the ruins of a failed colony, who maintained it against the most powerful naval force in the world for nearly a decade, and who were ultimately destroyed not by military defeat, but by the far more effective weapon of a legal pardon. The easy version of the story ends with the gallows. The pirates lost, the empire won. Law and order prevailed over chaos and violence, and everyone went home to build the civilized world. But that version leaves out the part where the ideas that Nassau embodied didn't die on the beach at Port Royal. They went somewhere. They traveled in the heads of sailors who had been to Nassau and seen what was possible. They circulated in the taverns of Boston and Charleston and Bridgetown, in the letters of merchants who had dealt with the pirates, in the court records of the trials that the British mounted with such urgency and thoroughness because they understood that the ideas were more dangerous than the men. Every society that calls itself free owes something to the people who were free before it was fashionable, who were free before it was legal, who were free at the cost of everything, in a harbor on a small limestone island in the Bahamas, with the Royal Navy over the horizon and nothing between them and the gallows but open water and a favorable wind. Nassau wasn't a utopia. It was something stranger and more interesting than that. It was an argument, made in ships and cutlasses and democratic articles and stolen rum, shouted into the Caribbean wind by people who had nothing to lose and understood that freedom wasn't something you waited for the powerful to grant you. You took it. You sailed out one morning under a black flag, and you took it. And for one extraordinary decade, on one small sweltering island at the edge of the Atlantic world, that argument won. Whether the ghost of that argument still haunts the harbor at Nassau is a question for philosophers and historians. But if you ever find yourself standing on that beach at dusk, watching the water turn gold and then red and then black, and you feel something you can't quite name, some faint resonance of all the desperate, ferocious, briefly free people who stood in exactly this spot 300 years ago, don't dismiss it. Some places hold their history in the air itself. Nassau is one of them. And history, unlike the men who made it, doesn't stay buried.